There was grim news a week ago when we heard that 3 Australians are imprisoned in Iran's notorious Evin prison. Travel bloggers Jolie King, and British Australian citizen, and Mark Firkin, an Australian citizen, and Melbourne University lecturer in Islamic Studies, Dr Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who's also a dual British Australian citizen. Dr Moore-Gilbert has reportedly been sentenced to 10 years in jail. Iran's judiciary on Tuesday said of the Australians, 2 of them had taken pictures in military areas and the third was detained for spying for a third country. The bloggers were arrested for flying a drone around 11 weeks ago. Now, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade released a statement from Dr Moore-Gilbert's family at the weekend confirming her arrest some time ago. The family said they believe diplomatic channels would be the best chance of securing her safe return and ask for privacy. But Dr Moore-Gilbert has reportedly been detained in solitary confinement for a year, which begs the question, are there other avenues that could secure her release? Well, Professor Peter Greste from the University of Queensland was arrested as a journalist in Egypt in December 2013, along with 2 other Al Jazeera English journalists. 6 months later, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. He spent a month in solitary confinement, but his families and supporters mounted a campaign on social media to have him released. And finally, he was in February 2015. Peter Greste joins me now. Peter Greste, good evening and welcome to the front page.
Good evening.
Peter, the British and Australian governments had been trying to keep the identities of their arrested citizens out of the public domain, we're told, believing that diplomatic efforts to have them released would be more effective if conducted behind closed doors. But others have argued that putting a public face on those detained will help generate international community and political support, providing further impetus for Iran to negotiate over their release. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, it's really difficult to comment on specific cases, and obviously I don't know much at all about the negotiations that have been taking place between Iran and the Australian government over these 3. But in my own experience, diplomats will instinctively want to carry out their negotiations, to do what diplomats do, and that's use diplomatic channels. What we found, though, is that the public campaign had a tremendous impact. I'm absolutely convinced that I would still be in prison if it weren't for the very vocal public support that we had. Now, as I said, I can't comment specifically on these cases, and there may be particular reasons why that isn't the best approach in this case. But I know that in mine and many other similar cases, the public pressure was absolutely crucial to getting us released.
You've got a very interesting anecdote because you were released, but at the time your Al Jazeera colleagues remained detained in an Egyptian prison. You've got a very interesting anecdote from a European diplomat at the time. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, of course. Look, what happened was that after my release, my 2 colleagues remained in Egypt and they were on trial. And so we had to keep up the pressure. Now, I went and spoke to a European diplomat, and I asked him what we could do to help support the negotiations. And he said, look, just keep up the Twitter campaign, keep up the pressure from groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And I said to him, look, the Egyptians don't give a toss about what Twitter says or what Amnesty or Human Rights Watch say. And he said, you're right, they don't, but I care. And he said, because as a diplomat, because I care, I can then go to the Egyptians, to my Egyptian counterparts, and say that you cannot normalise my relationship with me. I can't work with you until you resolve this issue because I've got all this pressure on my back. And so indirectly, that public campaign, as far as he was concerned, gave him the authority, gave him the impetus that he needed to apply pressure in the negotiations with his Egyptian counterparts. Now, as I said, it's very difficult to know whether it's going to be quite as effective in Iran's case, but there's no doubt, as I said, that it helped us.
Also, with regards to public campaigns, and your family were front and centre of that, I was talking to you last week and you said that humanises people. We need to get to know as much as possible these 3 Australians who are detained. How important is that sort of public campaign?
Oh, look, if you're going to go public, then you've got to go full public, and that means getting your friends and relatives to speak publicly, to be honest and open about their loved ones that are behind bars. Because what you need to do is make people understand that you're not simply a face or a job title, that you're someone who is a human being who's been able to operate with integrity, who has all of the kinds of characteristics that these 3 appear to be showing. I was very lucky. I mean, my family, my parents in particular, were incredibly effective at speaking. That wasn't engineered or manufactured. They just recognised that they needed to be out there, and they needed to be speaking genuinely from the heart. And I think that really had an incredibly powerful effect. I know that it helped humanise me, but if the truth be known, most Australians, I think, felt more for my parents than anything else. And so that kind of strategy is, we've shown that it worked. It galvanised a phenomenal international campaign to have us released. But the one thing I would say is that it is an incredibly difficult decision for families to take, because you can't roll back. Once you pull the trigger on that, there's no going back. And if you get it wrong, then obviously the consequences for those who are in prison could be very serious indeed. So let's not mistake the seriousness of the decisions that are being faced, the choices that are being faced by the families at this point.
Absolutely. The reports are that Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, she's a dual Australian British citizen, has been in solitary confinement in Evan Prison, which is notorious for housing political prisoners. The reports are that she's been there for almost a year in solitary confinement. Peter Greste, you've been in solitary confinement. What's it like?
Look, my blood ran cold when I heard that. One of the things that I realised very quickly is that the whole point of solitary confinement is to mess with your head. It's an extraordinarily difficult psychological problem for a prisoner to get through. I don't know exactly the conditions that she's under at the moment. When I was in solitary confinement, for a period we had no writing material, no reading material, not even watches to keep track of the time. And so in that void, your own head starts to turn in on itself, and it takes tremendous psychological discipline and resilience to survive that kind of pressure. Now, I wasn't in prison for anything, in solitary confinement, for anything like the length of time that we understand Kylie Moore-Gilbert has been there. And so, as I said, my heart goes out to her and her family, but obviously to Kylie in particular. It is an incredibly challenging kind of environment. And there's a reason why the United Nations classifies solitary confinement as a form of torture.
That sounds absolutely extraordinary. Look, that Twitter campaign, you're right. Your parents, so many of us in Australia felt terribly for your parents and for you. That Twitter campaign was extraordinarily powerful. How effective is social media in 2019?
You know, we understand that the Free AJ Staff hashtag that was associated with our case got something like 3 billion impressions. That's billion with a B. Now, I know that each time someone retweets or sends a message on Twitter, it can feel pretty ineffective. But the fact is that we would never have reached that colossal number unless people were individually messaging and tweeting and retweeting those Facebook and Twitter posts. And so, you know, it's indisputable that it has an impact. Each one on its own, no, not so much. But collectively, it sends a very clear, unequivocal message. And as I said earlier, it gives the diplomats and politicians the ammunition that they need, the political top cover that they need to really apply further pressure on the Iranians. You know, it works. I know that I'd still be in prison if we didn't have that.
And as you said, we don't know the particular circumstances of the case facing these 3 Australians. All we know is that it has been confirmed that they are in prison, and as you've highlighted, Peter, it's a very, very difficult time for their families, who at the moment have said that they are following the advice of the government and DFAT. Perhaps they'll change their minds. We just don't know. Peter Greste, I'm very, very pleased you not only got out of prison, that your colleagues were also allowed out of that Egyptian prison, and that you've been able to take time to discuss this matter with us tonight on the front page. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.